No gentleman in this room would lower himself to dance with a girl who arrived in borrowed gloves. Lady Honoria Valcourt said it loudly enough for the musicians to hear. The first notes of the waltz had scarcely begun, yet half the ballroom had already turned toward Marianne Bell. She stood beside a marble pillar in a pale blue gown that had belonged to another woman 8 years earlier. The silk had been altered twice. One sleeve sat slightly higher than the other. Her gloves were cream rather than white, and the stitching at one thumb had been repaired so carefully that only a woman determined to find poverty would have noticed it. Lady Honoria had noticed. So had her daughter Verity. A young baronet near the punch table laughed into his glass. Then another gentleman smiled. Then a cluster of ladies behind their fans allowed the sound to spread. Marianne felt the heat rise beneath her skin, while the great room seemed to grow colder around her. Lady Honoria extended one jeweled hand toward the empty dance floor beside Marianne. "There, my dear, you wish to see society. Now society has seen you." More laughter followed, not loud laughter. That would have been vulgar. This was worse. It came in small, polished sounds from people who had been taught since childhood how to wound without appearing to move. Marianne lowered her eyes. She would not beg. She would not flee. And she would not give Lady Honoria the pleasure of seeing her cry. Across the ballroom the doors opened. The Duke of Ravenshade entered. Every unmarried woman in the room straightened. Lady Verity smiled before he had even removed his gloves. But the Duke did not turn toward her. He walked past the Countess beside the fireplace, past two heiresses beneath the chandelier, past Lady Verity herself, and continued directly toward the poor girl standing alone beside the pillar. Yet no one in that glittering room understood that his next step would awaken a secret capable of changing more than one family forever. Before we return to Marianne, tell us where you are listening from tonight. If stories of dignity, hidden truth and justice beneath the chandeliers of Victorian England are your kind of tale, subscribe and turn on notifications and consider supporting the channel. Now let us go back to where Marianne Bell had first learned how expensive poverty could become. 3 months earlier, winter had settled over Ashcombe with a hard rain that turned every lane beyond the estate into black mud. Marianne had been 26 then. She had owned 2 respectable dresses, 1 serviceable cloak, 4 books, a silver thimble that had belonged to her mother, and £11 carefully folded inside a linen purse. 8 years before she had possessed rather more. Her father, Edmund Bell, had served as steward to the Valcourt family for nearly 2 decades. He had never been wealthy, but he had been trusted. He understood tenant rents, repairs, harvest accounts, coal allowances, wages, and every quiet expense by which a great estate pretended to function without effort. Then he had died. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. He had simply grown weaker through one wet autumn and failed to recover before Christmas. Marianne remembered the final weeks most clearly through small things: the spoon left untouched beside his broth, the smell of damp wool drying near the fire, the ink stain still visible upon his fingers even after he could no longer hold a pen. Sir Alistair Valcourt, Lady Honoria's late husband, had attended the funeral. Lady Honoria had not. Within a month, the rooms Marianne and her father had occupied near the estate offices were required for another purpose. Within 2 months, the modest allowance Sir Alistair had promised her was reduced. Within 6 months, it disappeared entirely. Marianne did not complain. She moved into 2 rooms above a widow's bakery in the village and began sewing. At first she altered cuffs, then bodices, then mourning dresses. Then, after a milliner noticed the precision of her hands, she was trusted with finer work. For the first time in her life, Marianne discovered that earning 6 shillings by her own labour gave her a strange satisfaction that receiving twice the sum from charity never had. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was something that belonged entirely to her. The village women came to know that Miss Bell could mend silk without puckering it. Farmers' wives brought Sunday dresses. A schoolmistress brought 2 wool skirts. Even Mrs. Finch, the senior housekeeper at Ashcombe, once appeared after dusk, carrying a torn black sleeve beneath her shawl. Mrs. Finch had served the Valcourts since before Marianne was born. She had a narrow face, sharp grey eyes, and the habit of saying dangerous things as though discussing potatoes. That evening, she sat beside Marianne's little fire while rain tapped the window. "Your father would have disliked seeing you charge so little," Marianne threaded her needle. My father disliked many things that could not be changed. Mrs. Finch gave a soft grunt. That was not one of his better qualities. It was the nearest the older woman ever came to making a joke. Marianne smiled despite herself. On the table between them stood the simple supper she had not yet eaten: brown bread, a little cheese, half an apple, and a pot of weak tea. At Ashcombe that same evening, Marianne knew dinner would probably require a silver service large enough to employ 3 footmen merely to move it. There would be roast pheasant, glazed carrots, preserved cherries, sugared almonds, wine, and little iced cakes sent up in tiers. The distance between those 2 tables was less than 2 miles. It might as well have been another country. Mrs. Finch watched Marianne make 3 tiny stitches. Then she said something that made Marianne stop. "Did your father ever speak to you about a blue account book?" Marianne looked up. "No." The older woman's eyes remained upon the fire. "Think carefully." "I am thinking carefully. A blue ledger, leather corners, brass clasp." Marianne shook her head. Mrs. Finch became very still. The rain filled the silence. "Why do you ask?" "No reason worth troubling yourself over. It was plainly a lie." Marianne set down the sleeve. "Mrs. Finch." The housekeeper sighed. "Your father spent the last year of his life arguing with Mr. Cresswell." Marianne knew the name. Gideon Cresswell had been Sir Alister's solicitor in matters connected with the estate. After Sir Alister died 3 years later, Cresswell had become indispensable to Lady Honoria. Some said he practically governed Ashcombe. About what Mrs. Finch pressed her lips together. "Money. What money? That is the part I do not know." Marianne waited. Mrs. Finch looked toward the narrow staircase leading down to the bakery. Only after footsteps below had passed did she continue. "I heard your father say that numbers do not become honest merely because a gentleman signs beneath them." Marianne felt something tighten inside her. Her father had been a cautious man. He did not make accusations. He barely made complaints. And Mr. Cresswell told him to remember his position. Marianne stared at the fire. Not fear. Not yet. What she felt was the first uneasy movement of an old memory. During her father's last winter, she had once entered his room after midnight and found him burning papers. He had pushed one sheet deep into the flames when she appeared. At the time, she had assumed they were private accounts. Now she remembered his expression. He had not looked embarrassed. He had looked frightened. Mrs. Finch stood abruptly. "Forget I mentioned it. You crossed the village in winter rain to have a sleeve repaired and happened to mention a ledger my father may have hidden 8 years ago." Mrs. Finch gave her a hard look. "Perhaps poverty has improved your intelligence. It has improved my attention." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Mrs. Finch reached into the pocket of her dress. She placed a tiny brass key on the table. Marianne stared at it. "What does it open? I hoped you could tell me." The key was dark with age. A thread of faded green silk remained tied through its bow. Marianne touched it with one finger. Something in her memory shifted. Her father had kept a writing box. Walnut, plain, always locked. After his death, Marianne had taken it with his books and papers, but no key had been found. She had tried twice to have the lock opened. The village carpenter had refused for fear of damaging the wood. Eventually, she had placed the box beneath her bed and forgotten it. Marianne rose so quickly her chair scraped the floor. Mrs. Finch whispered, "Quiet." They both froze. The bakery below had gone still. No footsteps climbed the stairs. Marianne knelt beside the narrow bed. Her fingers closed around the wooden box beneath it. Dust lined the lid. She carried it to the table. The brass key entered the lock. It turned. Neither woman breathed. The lid lifted. Inside lay 3 old receipts, a broken pencil sealing wax, and a folded handkerchief. Nothing more. Marianne's disappointment came so quickly that she almost laughed. Mrs. Finch frowned. "There ought to be papers. There are not." Marianne removed the contents one by one. The bottom was lined with green cloth. She pressed it. Something resisted beneath her fingers. Not the bottom. A false panel. Her father had hidden something underneath. Marianne worked one fingernail beneath the cloth edge and lifted. A narrow compartment appeared. Inside lay a single folded sheet. No blue ledger. Only paper. The writing was her father's. Marianne knew the sloping hand instantly. She unfolded it. There were columns of figures, several estate names and amounts beside them. Ashcombe North Cottages, Widow's Relief, Winter Coal, Roofing Repairs. Beside each entry her father had written 2 different amounts. One smaller, one larger. At the bottom appeared 3 words. Cresswell altered these. Mrs. Finch made a sound in her throat. Marianne read the figures again. What does it mean? It means I should never have brought you that key. The older woman reached for the paper. Marianne drew it back. You knew something was here. I suspected. Why now, Mrs.? Finch looked toward the rain-black window. Her answer came slowly. Because Lady Honoria has begun asking questions about you. That frightened Marianne more than the figures. Why should she care whether I breathe or not? Because Sir Alistair left instructions concerning you. Marianne stared. What instructions? I do not know all of it. Then tell me what you do know. Mrs. Finch hesitated. For the second time that evening, the room seemed to hold its breath. There was money intended for you. Marianne almost smiled from disbelief. My allowance ended 8 years ago. I am not speaking of your allowance. What then? Mrs. Finch lowered her voice. A settlement. The word seemed too large for the room. Marianne sat down. Her father had never spoken of such a thing. Sir Alistair had been generous in small ways when Marianne was a child. He had paid for her lessons. He had allowed her to use the estate library. Once after Marianne's mother died, he had told Edmund Bell that his daughter would never be abandoned while Ashcombe stood. But promises made by wealthy men often died before poor people could collect them. How much? I never saw the amount. Who did your father? Marianne looked at the altered accounts in her hand. Suddenly those last months of his life appeared differently. The late nights, the locked box, the arguments, the burned papers, not isolated memories. Pieces. And Mr. Cresswell. Mrs. Finch nodded once. A carriage passed below, wheels hissing through rain. Marianne's hand tightened around the sheet. Lady Honoria knows. Lady Honoria knows whatever Mr. Cresswell thinks useful for her to know. That answer was worse. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Ashcombe. Marianne recognized Lady Honoria's seal before breaking it. The message was brief. Lady Honoria Valcourt requested Miss Marianne Bell's presence at the house on Thursday afternoon regarding a matter connected with the late Edmund Bell. Marianne read it twice. Then she folded the altered account sheet into the lining of her sewing basket and went to Ashcombe. The great house looked exactly as it always had. Stone darkened by winter, windows glowing amber, smoke rising from 12 chimneys. But for the first time in her life, Marianne approached it as someone who no longer belonged there. A footman admitted her through the side entrance, not the principal door. She noticed. Poverty had improved her attention. Lady Honoria received her in the morning room. Verity sat near the fire wearing lavender silk. Gideon Cresswell stood beside a writing desk. He was a broad man in his 50s, perfectly shaved, perfectly dressed, and perfectly capable of making courtesy feel like a threat. On the desk lay a document. Cresswell smiled. Miss Bell. A simple matter. Marianne remained standing. Simple matters seldom require solicitors. Verity looked amused. Lady Honoria did not. Your father left certain confused claims among his papers. Mr. Cresswell wishes only to close them properly. Marianne glanced at the document. By asking for my signature, Cresswell turned it toward her, merely an acknowledgement that you have no outstanding financial claim against the Valcourt estate. Marianne heard Mrs. Finch's voice again. There was money intended for you. She kept her face still. Why should such an acknowledgement be necessary after 8 years? Cresswell's smile did not change. Good housekeeping. My father considered accounts good housekeeping. The room became silent. Lady Honoria's hand stopped above her teacup. Verity looked from Marianne to Cresswell. Not one of them knew how much Marianne knew. That was her only advantage. Cresswell placed a pen beside the paper. Sign Miss Bell. Marianne looked at him, then at Lady Honoria, then at the blank line waiting for her name. For the first time in her life she understood that appearing powerless could itself become a kind of shelter. She lowered her eyes. May I read it first? Lady Honoria laughed softly. Of course, though one wonders what a seamstress expects to discover in a solicitor's document. Marianne picked up the paper. She read slowly. Near the bottom, buried beneath language about allowances, obligations, prior payments, and voluntary renunciation, she found a phrase that made her pulse stumble. All monies held or formerly held in trust. Formerly held. Not imagined. Not promised. Held. She looked up. Cresswell was watching her too carefully. Marianne set down the document. "I should like one night to consider it." His expression hardened. "There is nothing to consider. Then one night cannot harm you." Lady Honoria rose. "You forget yourself." Marianne met her eyes. "No, my lady. I believe I have remembered myself rather suddenly." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Cresswell gathered the document. "Tomorrow morning, Miss Bell." His voice had lost its politeness. "You will return, and you will sign." Marianne inclined her head and left. Only when she reached the dark corridor did her hands begin to tremble. She passed the library. The door stood slightly open. Inside, Cresswell spoke before Marianne had gone 3 steps. "If she has found Edmund Bell's copy, the matter becomes considerably more difficult." Marianne stopped. Lady Honoria answered him. "Then make certain she does not have the opportunity to use it." Marianne did not move. She did not breathe. And from somewhere deeper inside the locked history of Ashcombe, one question rose above all the others. What copy had her father left behind? Fund of it 1/4 Quang 2, 458ths. 012. To Marianne did not remain in the corridor long enough to hear more. She walked. Not quickly. That would have betrayed her. She passed the portraits, descended the servants' staircase, accepted her cloak from the footman, and stepped into the winter rain with the same quiet expression she had worn inside. Only when Ashcombe disappeared behind the bare trees did she stop. Her breath came white in the darkness. If Cresswell believed her father had left a copy, then the sheet beneath the false bottom had not been the most important thing Edmund Bell had hidden. There was something else. And by morning, Cresswell expected Marianne to sign away the right to ever ask for it. She returned to the rooms above the bakery shortly before 7. Mrs. Finch was already waiting. The older woman stood beside the cold hearth with her wet shawl still around her shoulders. "You were followed." Marianne closed the door. "By whom?" "One of Mr. Go. Cresswell's men. Tall fellow. Brown coat. He stopped at the alehouse when he saw me come upstairs." Marianne removed her gloves. Her fingers were numb. "Then they are frightened." Mrs. Finch looked at her. "That is not the comforting thought you believe it is." For several seconds neither woman spoke. The silence in the little room felt very different from the silences of Ashcombe. Their silence belonged to power. Here it belonged to people trying to survive it. Marianne took out the altered account sheet. "They know there was a copy." Mrs. Finch's face changed. "You heard that Cresswell said it after I left the morning room." "Who was with him?" "Lady Honoria." Mrs. Finch shut her eyes briefly. "Then you must not return tomorrow. If I do not return, they will know I understand the document. They already know enough." Marianne looked at the rain running down the window. "No, they suspect." Suspicion is dangerous, but certainty is worse. For the first time in her life, Marianne understood why her father had sometimes answered a direct question with only half a truth. He had not been weak. He had been buying time. She turned toward Mrs. Finch. "I shall go back." "Marianne." "And I shall appear frightened." The housekeeper stared. That should not require acting. A small, unwilling smile touched Marianne's mouth. Then it vanished. "I need to know what copy he made." "Mrs." Finch sat down heavily. "If it still exists." Marianne heard the condition. "You think it may be inside Ashcombe?" "Mrs." Finch did not answer. That was answer enough. The following morning Marianne returned through the side entrance. Snow had begun before dawn, thin and dry, whitening the gravel while leaving the black branches exposed. A young maid named Bess admitted her. Bess could not have been more than 17. She had red hands from scrubbing and a narrow face that seemed permanently prepared to apologize. "Mr. Cresswell is in the library, miss." Marianne stopped. "The library," Bess nodded. Then she glanced behind her. "Lady Honoria said you were to wait in the small drawing room." Marianne noticed a faint purple mark around the girl's wrist. Not a bruise from violence. A burn, hot metal perhaps. The sort of injury a housemaid might acquire carrying a coal scuttle too close to the range. Marianne knew, because she had seen such marks before. Does Mrs. Finch know I am here? Bess swallowed. Mrs. Finch has been dismissed. The words struck harder than Marianne expected. When, this morning, why Bess looked toward the corridor. They said she stole correspondence. Marianne went still. Mrs. Finch had served Ashcombe for more than 30 years. No one who knew the woman would believe she stole so much as a pin. But truth was not the point. The accusation was. Lady Honoria had moved first. A servant accused of theft would struggle to find another respectable position. Her references would vanish. Her room would vanish. Her wages would vanish. The cold outside would become literal. Marianne tightened her hand around the handle of her sewing bag. Where is she? Packing. A man's voice sounded at the far end of the passage. Bess flinched. Please, miss, you must go to the drawing room. Marianne obeyed. Cresswell entered 5 minutes later carrying yesterday's document. Lady Honoria followed him. Verity did not. The absence was deliberate. This was no longer entertainment for the daughter of the house. It was business. Cresswell placed the paper before Marianne. I trust you have considered the matter. I have. Then sign. Marianne allowed her gaze to drop. I would like the wording changed. The room became silent. Lady Honoria almost laughed. Changed. Marianne touched the bottom of the page. This phrase, all monies held or formerly held in trust. I do not understand what it refers to. Cresswell's expression remained pleasant. His eyes did not. Legal phrasing. Then removing it should make no difference. It is unnecessary to remove it. Then perhaps it is necessary for it to remain. Lady Honoria set down her cup. Enough. Marianne looked at her. Lady Honoria's face had lost the polished amusement of the ballroom. There was irritation now, and behind it something sharper. Your father was employed by this family, Miss Bell. He was not our equal. Marianne said nothing. Sir Alister indulged him. Too much, perhaps. Your father misunderstood kindness for entitlement. Did Sir Alister create a trust in my name? The silence was absolute. Cresswell moved first. He folded the document. There was a provisional arrangement. Marianne felt her heartbeat in her throat. For how much? It never became operative. That was not my question. Lady Honoria stood. You have become remarkably impertinent for a woman who depends upon village sewing. There it was. Not an answer. A threat. Marianne raised her eyes slowly. Lady Honoria continued. Mrs. Harbury orders 3 gowns from you each season, I believe. Mrs. Ellison sends her daughters. The vicar's wife recommended you to half the parish. Marianne did not move. People are very careful about whom they allow into their homes, Lady Honoria said, especially when questions of honesty arise. Marianne understood. If she refused, Lady Honoria would not merely deny her money. She would destroy the little income Marianne had built stitch by stitch. It was not poverty that frightened her most. It was being pushed back into dependence after learning that her own hands could feed her. Cresswell slid the paper toward her again. Sign. Marianne looked at the pen. Then at the fire. Then at Lady Honoria. I shall not. No one moved. Cresswell's mask finally broke. Only slightly. His mouth tightened. You are making a grave mistake. Perhaps. Marianne rose. But it will be mine. Lady Honoria's voice followed her. You will regret that before the week is over. Marianne stopped at the door, not to plead, not to answer. She simply turned her head enough to show that she had heard. Then she left. Mrs. Finch's dismissal had been swift. Her room in the servants' wing was already half empty. 2 dresses lay folded on the bed. A Bible sat on top. Everything else the woman owned fitted inside one trunk. Marianne closed the door. You should not be here. Mrs. Finch did not turn from the drawer she was emptying. Nor should you. They accused you because of me. They accused me because Lady Honoria wished me gone. Because of me. Mrs. Finch faced her. Do not flatter yourself. I have irritated that woman since she married Sir Alister. The remark was dry, but the housekeeper's eyes were red. Marianne touched the trunk. Come to the village, and live above a bakery with you. Until we find something better. 2 stubborn women in 2 rooms and only 1 decent chair. We shall take turns. Mrs. Finch looked at her for several seconds. Then she sat on the bed. For the first time since Marianne had known her, the older woman seemed tired. Your father hid the ledger in the West Library. Marianne stared. You knew. I knew where he was going the night before he died. Why did you not tell me? Because 8 years ago you were 18, grieving and alone. If I had handed you a ledger accusing Mr. Cresswell of stealing estate money, what would you have done? Marianne had no answer. Mrs. Finch nodded. Exactly. Where in the library? Behind the lower shelves near the old Atlas case. Then we get it tonight. We do nothing of the kind. They are watching my rooms, and now watching me. Marianne paced once toward the window. She forced herself to stop. Think. That was what her father had taught her when accounts would not balance. Do not stare at the number that is wrong. Find the number that had to change for it to become wrong, Bess Marianne said. Mrs. Finch looked up. What about her? She told me you had been dismissed before I entered the drawing room, and she was frightened. Every maid in Ashcombe is frightened this week. Marianne turned. Why? Mrs. Finch hesitated. Cresswell has had trunks moved into the West Library. Papers mostly. Why, no one knows. Marianne thought of the hidden ledger. If Cresswell had discovered where Edmund Bell once worked privately, perhaps he was searching for it, or perhaps he meant to destroy anything that remained. That evening Marianne did not return directly to her rooms. She went instead to Briarwood Market, 6 miles from Ashcombe, where she knew a widowed dressmaker named Mrs. Pike. Mrs. Pike had once offered Marianne regular work. The wages were modest, the hours long, but the position included a small room above the shop. Marianne had refused before because she preferred independence. Now independence required strategy. Mrs. Pike listened without asking unnecessary questions. You can begin Monday. Marianne blinked. You have not asked why I need to leave the village. If a woman arrives in winter asking for work rather than charity, I assume she has reasons. Marianne swallowed. I can sew 12 hours if necessary. 9 will do. I have no wish to bury you in muslin. That night, Marianne returned home with employment promised. Not salvation, employment. That distinction mattered, she told Mrs. Finch. The older woman nodded. Good. You will come with me. I am nearly 60. Then you have had nearly 60 years to become useful. Mrs. Finch gave her a look. Your manners are deteriorating. Poverty. Naturally. For a moment they both laughed. It lasted only a few seconds. The next morning the first client cancelled. By noon 3 more had done the same. By evening Mrs. Harbury's servant arrived to collect unfinished fabric and said her mistress had been advised that Marianne's circumstances were no longer respectable. Lady Honoria had kept her promise. 2 days later the bakery widow received a letter. Marianne was given a week to leave. The widow cried while telling her, I cannot risk it, miss. My lease belongs to the estate. Marianne did not blame her. That was how power worked. Not through one dramatic blow, through rent, references, invitations, whispers. The poor were not crushed by a single door closing. They were crushed when every door belonged to the same person. Marianne packed. On Friday evening Bess appeared at the bakery. She came through the back entrance and wore no cloak despite the snow. Marianne pulled her upstairs at once. You will freeze. Bess's teeth were chattering. Mrs. Finch put a blanket around her shoulders. What happened? Bess looked at the door. Mr. Cresswell is burning papers. Marianne's stomach tightened. Where? West Library fireplace. Mrs. Finch stood. What papers? I do not know. Bess pressed both hands around the tea Marianne gave her. But I heard him speaking with Lady Honoria. Marianne crouched beside the chair. Tell us exactly. Bess looked from one woman to the other. He said the Bell accounts had to disappear before the Ravenshade party arrived. Marianne frowned. Ravenshade, Mrs. Finch's expression changed. The Duke. What does the Duke of Ravenshade have to do with Ashcombe? His late father held land adjoining the northern farms. Bess shook her head quickly. There was more. She swallowed. Mr. Cresswell said if His Grace compared the old tenant assessments with the new ones, he might ask where the difference had gone. The room went silent. Marianne's father's sheet listed North Cottages, winter coal, repairs, money allocated for people who had likely never received it. This was larger than Marianne's settlement. She had believed Cresswell had stolen from her. Now it seemed possible he had stolen through the estate itself. From tenants, from relief funds, perhaps from Sir Alister. "How did you hear this?" Marianne asked. Bess lowered her voice. "The library door was left a little open. I was carrying coal. They thought I had gone downstairs. An ajar door. Again." Truth in Ashcombe seemed unable to travel through proper entrances. Marianne took Bess's cold hand. "Did they see you?" "No." "Are you certain?" Bess nodded, then hesitated. "I think so." That hesitation mattered. Mrs. Finch began putting on her shawl. "We must get the ledger tonight." Marianne looked at her. 5 minutes ago you would not let me. 5 minutes ago I thought we had time. They entered Ashcombe through the kitchen yard just after 11. Mrs. Finch still had a key to the old laundry passage. No one had remembered to take it from her. Snow covered the courtyard. The kitchen was nearly dark. A scullery maid slept beside the banked range. Marianne and Mrs. Finch moved without speaking. The servants' corridor smelled of ashes, soap onions, and damp wool. No chandelier, no polished silver, no music. Yet Marianne had never understood Ashcombe better than she did while walking through the passages the family rarely saw. Every great house had two versions of itself, the one displayed and the one carrying it. They reached the West Library. Locked. Mrs. Finch produced another key. "You kept many keys for a dismissed woman." "I was housekeeper for 31 years. The lock turned. The room smelled of smoke. The fireplace still glowed. Ash lay thick beneath the grate. Bundles of papers stood beside the desk. Marianne went directly to the atlas case. She knelt. Lower shelf. Oak panel. Nothing. Mrs. Finch joined her. They pressed along the wood. No catch. No hollow sound. Nothing. Marianne's chest tightened. "It is gone." Mrs. Finch stared at the shelves. He found it. A floorboard creaked in the corridor. Both women froze. Another step. Then another. Someone was coming. Mrs. Finch pulled Marianne behind the heavy curtain beside the window. The library door opened. Gideon Cresswell entered. He carried a candle. Lady Honoria followed. They stopped only yards away. Marianne could see them through the narrow gap between curtain and wall. Cresswell placed a packet on the desk. "Bell's daughter leaves tomorrow. For Briarwood," Lady Honoria said. Marianne felt cold. They knew. "She will not remain there long," Cresswell replied. "Mrs. Pike's landlord can be persuaded." Lady Honoria sounded impatient. "And the ledger—" Cresswell looked toward the fireplace. "Not here." Marianne nearly stopped breathing. Then Edmund Bell gave it to someone, or hid it elsewhere. Lady Honoria paced once. "Ravenshade arrives in 3 weeks. I will not have him asking questions. His Grace is coming for the winter assembly, not to inspect tenant accounts. His father questioned those accounts once." Cresswell's face hardened and died before he could pursue the matter. The words seemed to alter the air. Lady Honoria stopped moving. "Be careful." "I merely stated a fact." Cresswell opened the packet. Inside lay several folded documents. "Marianne Bell's settlement is the smaller danger." Marianne pressed one hand against the wall. "The smaller danger," Cresswell continued. "Sir Alister's private memorandum is the greater one. If that document survives with Bell's ledger, the northern transfers can be reconstructed." Lady Honoria spoke more quietly. "Then find them." Cresswell folded the papers again. "I intend to." Footsteps sounded somewhere beyond the library. Lady Honoria turned. "Someone is awake." They left. The door closed. Marianne remained behind the curtain until her legs began to ache. "Mrs. Finch finally whispered, "We must go." Marianne stepped out. Her mind was racing. Settlement. Ledger. Northern transfers. Sir Alister's memorandum. The Duke of Ravenshade. 4 separate pieces. Perhaps one story. She looked at the dying fire. A corner of paper showed beneath the iron grate. Marianne knelt. "Mrs. Finch hissed, "Leave it." But Marianne had already reached for the poker. She drew the half-burned sheet from the ash. Most of it was blackened. One edge remained readable. There was a date, several initials, and one line in her father's hand, "Copy sent to R." Below it, barely untouched by the flames, was the beginning of a name. Ravens Marianne stared. Her father had not merely hidden evidence, he had sent part of it away. And somewhere beyond Ashcombe, perhaps in the possession of a family powerful enough to make Lady Honoria afraid another copy might still exist. But when Marianne turned toward the door, Mrs. Finch was no longer looking at the paper. She was looking at the library window. Outside in the snow, a man in a brown coat stood watching them. Phần đã viết 2, 4 khoảng 4,90, 8, 12 2. The man in the brown coat did not move. Snow gathered along his shoulders. His face remained hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But Marianne knew the shape of him. He was the same man Mrs. Finch had seen outside the alehouse, Cresswell's watcher. For 1 second, nobody breathed. Then Mrs. Finch seized Marianne's wrist. Kitchen passage. Now. They moved, not toward the main door, not toward the corridor where Cresswell might return. Mrs. Finch led Marianne through a narrow service door, concealed behind a panel of bookshelves down 3 stone steps, and into the old passage once used for carrying coal from the rear yard. Marianne clutched the half-burned page beneath her cloak. Behind them, the library window rattled. Someone was trying the latch. Mrs. Finch did not look back. They crossed the laundry, slipped past the sleeping scullery maid, and reached the kitchen yard. The snow outside was deeper now. Marianne's shoes sank at once. The cold bit through the soles. They ran anyway. Only after the Ashcombe wall had disappeared behind bare hedges did Mrs. Finch stop. She bent forward, breathing hard. Marianne looked back. No lantern followed them. No shout came through the snow. Still, she knew they had lost something important that night. Not the paper. Secrecy. Cresswell would now know they were searching. By morning, Marianne and Mrs. Finch had left the village. They did not wait for the bakery widow's deadline. They took the first hired cart toward Briarwood Market, sitting beneath a patched canvas, while sleet struck the road, and wind forced itself through every gap. Mrs. Finch kept the small trunk between her knees. Marianne held the sewing basket. Inside its lining lay the altered accounts. Inside her bodice lay the burned page. Everything she possessed that might matter could have fitted beneath one arm. For the first time in her life, Marianne understood that losing a home was not an idea. It was weight. 1 trunk, 1 basket, 1 cloak still damp from snow, and no key in her pocket that opened a place belonging to her. Briarwood was no grand refuge. The market square smelled of horses, onions, wet straw lamp oil, and bread cooling on wooden racks. Mrs. Pike's shop stood between a stationer and a cellar of household pots. Above the narrow windows hung a faded, painted sign. Pike and Daughter Dressmakers. There had been no daughter for 7 years. She had died of fever. Mrs. Pike had never changed the sign. Marianne began work the same afternoon. She cut lining, replaced hooks, reset pleats. Unpicked poor stitching done by wealthy customers' maids. She worked beneath a broad, north-facing window because Mrs. Pike believed good light saved eyes and mistakes. Mrs. Finch found work 2 streets away, keeping house for an elderly bookseller. Neither woman earned much. Both women ate. That was enough for the first week. Then Marianne did something she had never done before. She began keeping accounts for the dress shop. Mrs. Pike's books were not dishonest. They were chaotic. Fabric costs appeared on scraps. Customer debts were remembered rather than written. Buttons and thread were purchased without comparison. 2 suppliers had charged different rates for the same muslin because Mrs. Pike never checked one invoice against another. Marianne asked permission to reorganize everything. Mrs. Pike stared at her over a pair of spectacles. "You are employed to sew. I can do both." "Can you?" Marianne thought of her father's ink-stained fingers. Yes, within a month she proved it. The shop had not been losing money because business was poor. It had been losing money because no one knew where the money went. Marianne created columns. Materials, labor, deposits, outstanding balances, delivery, expenses, waste. For the first time in Mrs. Pike's 22 years of trade, every shilling could be followed from customer to drawer. The change was small, then visible, then undeniable. Mrs. Pike stopped borrowing at the end of each week. 2 apprentices received their wages on time. A supplier who had quietly increased prices was replaced. Marianne began taking private alteration work in the evenings and saving part of every payment. Not charity, not inheritance, not rescue, work. For the first time in her life, Marianne felt pride without needing anyone's permission to feel it. At night, however, Ashcombe remained open in her mind. The ledger, the memorandum, the northern transfers. And one half-burned line. Copy sent to R. She wrote nothing down. Cresswell had already searched once. She would not make his work easier. Instead, Marianne rebuilt the facts from memory. Sir Alistair had maintained some form of settlement for her. Edmund Bell had discovered altered estate accounts. Cresswell had feared comparisons with older northern assessments. Marianne's father had made or sent a copy to someone whose name began Ravens. The late Duke of Ravenshade had once questioned those same accounts. That could not be coincidence. But coincidence was not evidence. She needed proof. 3 weeks passed. Then Bess arrived. The girl entered Mrs. Pike's shop shortly before, closing pale with exhaustion and carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Marianne recognized her at once. What happened? Bess looked toward the windows. I left Ashcombe. Were you dismissed? The girl shook her head. I ran. Mrs. Pike quietly turned the sign on the door and locked it. No questions. Only action. Marianne led Bess upstairs. Mrs. Finch arrived half an hour later. They sat around the little table in Marianne's room. Bess held the brown parcel in both hands. Mr. Cresswell knows someone entered the library. Marianne said nothing. He questioned everyone. Then he found the laundry passage unlocked. Mrs. Finch's mouth tightened. My fault. No, Bess said quickly. He blamed Thomas. Who is Thomas? The underfootman. Bess looked down. He dismissed him without a reference. Marianne felt the old anger rise. Another servant punished because powerful people feared paper. Why did you leave? Bess placed the parcel on the table. Because I found this. Inside lay 3 folded sheets, not originals. Copies. The handwriting was not Edmund Bell's. Marianne examined the first. It contained tenant names. Beside them were annual rents. Then a second column, larger sums. At the bottom appeared Cresswell's initials. The second sheet listed repairs authorized for cottages on the northern edge of Ashcombe, roof tiles, chimney masonry, drainage, coal grants. The work had been approved, money had been released, but beside several entries, someone had written not completed. The third page contained names Marianne recognized from her father's hidden sheet. Bess spoke softly. I found them inside Mr. Cresswell's old dispatch case. Mrs. Finch went rigid. You stole them, I copied them. Marianne looked up sharply. Bess swallowed. I learned letters from my brother. I can copy a page if I have time. Marianne stared at the girl's reddened hands. This was the truth, Mrs. Finch had once described. Not handed down by a duke, not declared by a magistrate, carried upward by a housemaid who had scrubbed floors beneath the people stealing from tenants. Why did you risk it? Bess's answer came slowly. My mother lives in North Cottage 6. The room became silent. The chimney has cracked for 2 winters, Bess continued. Mrs. Finch requested repairs twice. Mr. Cresswell said the estate had no money for it. She pointed to the copied sheet. It says the chimney was repaired last year. Marianne looked down. Paid, completed, but never repaired. This was no abstract theft. Someone had taken money while Bess's mother slept beneath broken masonry. Marianne folded the sheets carefully. These are valuable. Mrs. Finch shook her head. Valuable is not the same as sufficient. She was right. Copies made by a maid could be dismissed. Cresswell would call them fabrication. Lady Honoria would call Bess dishonest. The ballroom would believe whichever version allowed dinner to continue uninterrupted. Marianne needed the originals, or someone powerful enough to demand them. She thought of the Duke of Ravenshade, then dismissed the thought. She had never met him. She had no right to expect rescue from a man merely because he possessed a title. No. If Ravenshade mattered, he would matter as a piece of evidence. Nothing more. 2 days later, Marianne went to London. Mrs. Pike had a delivery to make to a customer near Bloomsbury and agreed to let Marianne accompany the hired carrier. London overwhelmed her at first. Carriages seemed to move without mercy. Gas lamps stood pale in the afternoon mist. The railway stations breathed steam into the cold. People passed without knowing who she was, or who Lady Honoria was. That anonymity felt almost luxurious. Marianne carried one address: Ravenshade House. She did not go to the principal entrance. Instead, she went to the solicitor whose name appeared on old correspondence Mrs. Finch had remembered from Sir Alister's affairs. Mr. Abel Hartwell. His office stood near Lincoln's Inn. Marianne waited almost 2 hours. When Hartwell finally received her, he was a thin man with silver hair and no patience for unnecessary drama. She gave him no drama, only facts. Her father, the altered sheet, the proposed renunciation, the burned page. Bess's copies. Hartwell listened. Then he asked one question. Why come to me? Marianne placed the half-burned paper on his desk. He read the surviving line. Copy sent to R. His expression changed. I know this hand. Marianne's heart beat harder. My father's, yes. Edmund Bell sent 3 packets through this office. Marianne stared. To whom? Hartwell folded his hands. The late Duke of Ravenshade. Silence filled the room. Not shock. Confirmation. Hartwell continued. His Grace had questioned discrepancies between rents collected from adjoining tenants and reports submitted to neighboring estates. Bell supplied material privately. Does that material still exist? Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. Some of it. Marianne almost stood. Where? In the Ravenshade. Family papers. Then we need it. Hartwell's expression remained cautious. Mr. Hartwell Cresswell is destroying documents. That is a serious allegation. Marianne placed Bess's copied sheets beside the burned page. So is stealing repair money from tenants. Hartwell read them. His face did not change. That made Marianne trust him more. At last he leaned back. The present Duke arrives in London tomorrow. Marianne said nothing. I can request access to the late Duke's correspondence. Request? His papers belong to his son. Marianne looked at the fire. Once she would have stopped there. A duke owned the evidence. A solicitor controlled access. A lady controlled reputation. A poor seamstress waited. But the woman who had kept Mrs. Pike's books for 6 weeks understood something different. Records belonged to whoever could read what they proved. Then request it. Hartwell almost smiled. You speak as though I work for you. At present nobody else appears willing to. That time he did smile. Very slightly. Come tomorrow at 4. The Duke of Ravenshade did not come at 4. Marianne waited until 5, then 6. At 6:30 Hartwell entered alone. His expression told her enough. His Grace declined. Marianne felt the disappointment before she could prevent it. Did he give a reason? He is attending the Ashcombe Winter Assembly next week. Marianne stared. Hartwell continued. He said any old estate misunderstanding should be discussed directly with Lady Honoria. For one dangerous instant, Marianne thought the entire road had ended. Cresswell had been right. A duke might simply choose comfort, choose rank, choose dinner over truth. Mrs. Finch had lost her position. Bess had fled. Thomas had lost his reference. Marianne had lost her customers and home. And the man whose family papers might prove everything had decided it was an old misunderstanding. She stood. Thank you for your time. Hartwell frowned. Miss Bell, I have sewing waiting in Briarwood. There may be another route. Marianne turned. Hartwell opened a drawer. He removed a sealed envelope. The Duke declined to release his father's private correspondence. Marianne waited. He did not decline to examine it himself. Hartwell placed the envelope on the desk. He asked for your evidence. Marianne's pulse shifted. Why? Because the name Edmund Bell meant something to him. Hope rose. She crushed it immediately. Not hope. A possibility. That was safer. Give him copies. Not the originals. No. Hartwell's eyebrows lifted. Sensible. Poverty has improved my attention. Hartwell clearly did not understand the remark. Marianne did not explain. She returned to Briarwood. Then she worked. For the next 5 days, nothing happened. No letter from Hartwell. No message from Ravenshade. Nothing. Marianne stitched a green evening gown, balanced Mrs. Pike's accounts, taught one apprentice how to calculate fabric waste. helped Bess find temporary work at the bookseller's home where Mrs. Finch served. At night, she waited, then stopped waiting. On the 6th morning, a carriage from Ashcombe arrived outside Mrs. Pike's shop. Verity Vailcourt stepped down. The entire workroom noticed. She wore dark plum-wool pearl earrings, kid gloves, and the expression of someone entering a place where prices ought not apply to her. Mrs. Pike approached. "May I help you? I wish to speak with Marianne Bell." Marianne came forward. Verity looked around the shop. "So this is where you have landed?" Marianne did not answer. Verity smiled. "Mamma is giving the winter assembly on Thursday." "I know." The smile faltered. "You are invited." Mrs. Pike's scissors stopped. Marianne looked at Verity. "Why does it matter?" "Yes." Verity lowered her voice. "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshade, asked whether you would be present." Marianne felt every eye in the workroom turn toward her. She kept her face still. "Why would he ask that? I assumed you had written to him." "I have never written to the Duke." That was true. Verity studied her. Suspicion appeared, then irritation. "Whatever game you are playing, Marianne, you should remember that Ashcombe is not Briarwood Market." "I remember Ashcombe very well." Verity stepped closer. "Then remember your place." There it was again. The sentence people used when facts became inconvenient. Marianne almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Verity removed an invitation from her reticule. "Mamma expects you to behave with gratitude." Marianne accepted the card. "Your mother has never expected gratitude from me." "What does that mean?" "It means she expects obedience." Verity's face hardened. "You were always peculiar, and you were always protected from knowing why." For once, Verity had no answer. She left. Marianne looked at the invitation. The winter assembly. The same ballroom where Lady Honoria gathered landowners' officers' widows with fortunes, young women with dowries, and men who measured one another by acreage, a court of public opinion. Exactly the place Lady Honoria believed she ruled. Mrs. Finch arrived that evening. Bess came with her. Hartwell's message had reached the bookseller first. The solicitor would attend the assembly. So would a magistrate from the district invited weeks earlier on unrelated business. And the Duke of Ravenshade had personally requested that several old Ashcombe account books be brought from storage before the gathering. Marianne looked at Mrs. Finch. "He found something, perhaps, or he found nothing, and wishes to question us publicly." Mrs. Finch considered that. Then tell the truth publicly. Marianne walked to the window. Snow had begun again. Behind her, Bess said quietly, "I will speak." Marianne turned. The girl looked frightened, very frightened, but she repeated it. "If they say those repairs were done, I will speak." Mrs. Finch took Bess's hand. Marianne understood then that the trap no longer belonged to her alone. It had been built from everyone Cresswell had considered too insignificant to matter. A steward, a dismissed housekeeper, a maid, a seamstress. Pieces from below, rising. Thursday evening came. Marianne wore the pale blue gown Mrs. Pike had altered for her. It belonged originally to a customer who had abandoned it after discovering the shade did not flatter her complexion. Mrs. Pike had insisted Marianne borrow it. The gloves came from an apprentice, cream, mended at the thumb. Marianne entered Ashcombe, knowing perfectly well what Lady Honoria would see. Dependence. Second-hand silk. A woman who had once belonged near the estate offices and now entered the ballroom on sufferance. The room glittered. Candles burned in tiers. A chandelier scattered light over polished floors. Ladies moved beneath it in satin velvet pearls, jet ornaments, embroidered fans and gloves, so white they seemed untouched by human work. The musicians began the first set. No gentleman approached Marianne. One noticed her, then looked away. Another bowed from a distance but chose a baronet's daughter. Verity stood surrounded by admirers. Lady Honoria crossed the room. Her smile was beautiful. No gentleman in this room would lower himself to dance with a girl who arrived in borrowed gloves. The laughter came exactly as cruelty preferred to come among civilized people. Softly, Marianne stood beside the marble pillar. She felt the humiliation. She did not pretend otherwise. Her cheeks burned. Her chest tightened. For one instant she was again 18 years old, carrying one trunk out of Ashcombe. Then she remembered Mrs. Pike's ledger, Bess's copies, her father's handwriting. The half-burned page. She straightened. The ballroom doors opened. A servant announced the Duke of Ravenshade. Conversation changed at once. Women turned. Men adjusted their posture. Lady Honoria's smile became welcoming. Verity stepped forward. The Duke entered in black evening clothes, tall, composed, and younger than Marianne had expected. He greeted Lady Honoria, then looked across the ballroom. His gaze found Marianne. Lady Verity moved subtly into his path. He passed her. A countess smiled. He passed her. Two heiresses waited near the musicians. He passed them too. The room slowly fell silent. The Duke crossed the floor directly toward Marianne. He stopped before her. Not close enough to presume, close enough that every person who had laughed could hear. He bowed. "Miss Bell, would you honor me with this dance?" No one breathed. Marianne looked at his extended hand, then at Lady Honoria, then at Cresswell standing near the far wall. For the first time that evening, Gideon Cresswell looked afraid. Marianne placed her hand in the Duke's. But as the musicians raised their bows, the Duke of Ravenshade leaned just close enough for only her to hear. "Your father's ledger has been found." And across the ballroom, Mr. Hartwell had just entered carrying a locked dispatch case. Fun David 3/4 swung 7, 458ths, 0, 12, 2. The musicians began. Marianne moved because stopping would have given the room another kind of spectacle. The Duke of Ravenshade guided her into the first turn of the waltz. Every eye followed them. She felt the pressure of those eyes more keenly than the Duke's hand at hers. Lady Honoria stood near the marble fireplace. Verity had gone pale. Gideon Cresswell had not moved at all. Marianne kept her voice low. "Where was the ledger?" "My father's papers contained a letter from Edmund Bell." The Duke turned her beneath the chandelier. "Your father sent him the original instructions." Marianne's pulse quickened. "Instructions to what a storage box in London registered under my father's solicitor. Bell feared his rooms would be searched." Another turn. Around them, silk moved and jewels flashed. The room had resumed breathing, but conversation had not recovered. The Duke continued. "Hartwell found the box yesterday. And the ledger inside." Marianne nearly missed a step. The Duke steadied her without appearing to do so. "Does it prove what we think?" "More." The single word chilled her. "Your settlement was real. Sir Alistair placed money in trust after your mother died." Marianne looked directly at him. "How much enough that you should never have been forced from Ashcombe without provision?" She did not ask again. Not yet. Money mattered. But suddenly another image mattered more. Bess's mother beneath a cracked chimney, Mrs. Finch packing 31 years of service into one trunk, Thomas losing his reference. The tenants listed as repaired when their roofs still leaked. And the northern accounts, the Duke's expression hardened. "We will discuss those after the dance." Marianne understood. Not privately, publicly. Lady Honoria had chosen the ballroom as the place to humiliate her. Now that same ballroom would hear the answer. The dance ended. The Duke of Ravenshade bowed. Marianne curtsied. For a moment no one applauded. Then an elderly gentleman near the musicians struck his hands together once. Another joined. Then several more. Lady Honoria raised her chin. "How charming." Her voice crossed the room. "His Grace has always possessed a generous nature." The insult was elegant. The meaning was not. "He danced with you out of pity." Marianne felt it land. But this time the laughter did not follow. The Duke turned toward Lady Honoria. Generosity had nothing to do with it. The ballroom became silent. One of the musicians lowered his violin. Lady Honoria smiled. "Surely we need not dissect a dance." "No, but perhaps we should examine an account." Cresswell moved. "Your Grace, if this concerns estate business, I would be pleased to meet with you tomorrow." The Duke of Ravenshade looked at him. "I believe tomorrow has been useful to you for many years, Mr. Cresswell." Nobody laughed. Cresswell's face tightened. Mr. Hartwell approached carrying the dispatch case. Beside him walked a grey-haired gentleman Marianne recognized from village court business. The magistrate, Lady Honoria, saw him. For the first time the confidence in her expression shifted, only slightly, but Marianne saw it. Poverty had improved her attention. The Duke addressed the room. I regret interrupting Lady Honoria's assembly. However, several people present tonight hold interests in the northern lands surrounding Ashcombe. Others have tenants whose accounts were affected by the same assessments. I believe what follows concerns more than one household. Cresswell stepped forward. Your Grace, I must protest. You may. These are private estate matters. A voice came from the servants' entrance. They were not private when my mother's roof leaked. Heads turned. Bess stood in the doorway. She wore a plain, dark dress borrowed from Mrs. Pike. Her hands were clasped so tightly that the knuckles had whitened. Lady Honoria's face sharpened. Who admitted that girl, Mrs. Finch, stepped into view behind her? I did. A murmur passed through the guests. Several remembered Mrs. Finch. Most had accepted her service for years without ever truly seeing her. Now she walked into the ballroom through the same door by which servants carried trays. She stopped beside Bess. Lady Honoria spoke. Mrs. Finch, you were dismissed for theft. Mrs. Finch looked at her steadily. I was dismissed after 31 years because Mr. Cresswell believed I knew where Edmund Bell had hidden his papers. Cresswell laughed once, too quickly. This is absurd. Mr. Hartwell placed the locked case on a table. Then the papers should resolve the absurdity. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Hartwell unlocked the case. Inside lay a blue ledger, leather corners, brass clasp. Marianne stared at it. Her father had touched that book. He had written in it late at night. He had hidden it because he had known what truth cost a man without title or fortune. For 8 years Marianne had thought his fear had died with him. Now his careful columns lay beneath candlelight before the very people who had benefited from never asking questions. Hartwell opened the ledger. These entries record sums approved for northern cottage repairs, winter coal drainage and relief. Cresswell interrupted. Anyone can write numbers into a book. The Duke nodded. Precisely why we compared them. Hartwell produced a second set of papers, with bank records retained among the late Duke's estate papers, Sir Alister's private memorandum and several surviving receipts. Cresswell's eyes went to Lady Honoria. Marianne saw it. So did the Duke. The magistrate spoke for the first time. Mr. Cresswell, I suggest you allow Mr. Hartwell to continue. The authority in his voice changed the room. This was no longer gossip. Hartwell read 3 examples. Money had been approved for repairs. The accounts later showed those repairs completed. But payments had been redirected through contractors linked to Cresswell's private interests. In several cases, no work had been done at all. A landowner near the fireplace swore beneath his breath. Another gentleman stepped closer. Lady Honoria raised one hand. I knew nothing of contractors. Marianne believed that part might even be true. Cresswell turned toward her. My lady. Lady Honoria did not look at him. Hartwell continued. The same ledger contains an entry regarding a private trust established by Sir Alister Valecourt for Marianne Bell. Now every face turned toward Marianne. This time she did not lower her eyes. The principal was transferred 6 months after Edmund Bell's death, Hartwell said. Not to Miss Bell. Cresswell spoke sharply. It was absorbed into estate liabilities by authority of Lady Honoria. Lady Honoria turned. You told me the trust had failed. There it was. Not defense. Separation. Cresswell stared at her. The Duke looked between them. Then perhaps each of you should explain what you believed happened. Lady Honoria's lips thinned. Sir Alister was excessively sentimental. He made promises to servants, to tenants, to dependents. After his death, there were obligations everywhere. Marianne felt the words like a slap delivered 8 years late. Dependents. That was what Lady Honoria thought she had been. Not a young woman whose father had served faithfully. An obligation. The Duke said quietly, A lawful trust is not sentiment. Lady Honoria's composure cracked. Do not lecture me about managing a widowed estate. The room went still again. For the first time that evening, Marianne saw something human beneath the hardness. Fear. Lady Honoria had inherited a household full of debts she had not understood. A solicitor had offered certainty, control, order, and she had chosen not to ask what that order cost people beneath her. Not innocence. Not the same guilt as Cresswell's, but guilt nonetheless. Cresswell stepped backward. Hartwell produced another sheet. Mr. Cresswell, this bears your signature authorizing transfer of Miss Bell's trust. into an account later used for northern land purchases. Cresswell looked toward the ballroom doors. The magistrate noticed. "I would advise against leaving." A whisper moved through the guests. Then Bess stepped forward. Her voice trembled. "There is more." Lady Honoria closed her eyes. Bess looked terrified. Marianne crossed the room and stood beside her. Not in front. Beside. Bess swallowed. "I copied 3 pages from Mr. Cresswell's dispatch case." Cresswell seized the opportunity. "A maid admits theft before a magistrate. I copied them." Bess repeated. "I returned the originals." "Convenient." Bess's face went red. Then another voice came from the servants' doorway. "She did." Thomas, the dismissed underfootman, entered. His coat was worn and his hair still wet with snow. Cresswell stared. Thomas bowed awkwardly toward the magistrate. "I saw her put them back, sir. Mr. Cresswell dismissed me because the laundry passage was found open. I never opened it." The silence this time was different. Not uncertainty, recognition. The people in the ballroom were beginning to see a pattern. Every person who could contradict Cresswell had somehow become dishonest. A steward, a housekeeper, a maid, a footman. Too many liars made one truth. The magistrate asked Bess to describe the copied pages. She did. Hartwell opened the blue ledger and found corresponding entries. The amounts matched. Cresswell's face lost color. Lady Honoria sank into a chair. Verity remained beside the fireplace. She had not spoken since the Duke entered. Marianne looked at her. For the first time, Verity did not look proud. She looked young and ashamed. The Duke addressed Cresswell. "My father suspected irregularities years ago. Edmund Bell supplied evidence but died before the matter could be fully examined. You relied upon silence after that." Cresswell's voice had become hoarse. "You cannot prove criminal intent from account discrepancies." The magistrate answered, "That determination will not be made in a ballroom." He glanced at Hartwell. "But there is certainly enough here to justify formal examination of the surviving records." No dramatic arrest followed. No chains. No men rushed forward. Reality was slower, and perhaps more frightening. Cresswell would face solicitors. Account examinations. Questions under oath where appropriate. Clients withdrawing their trust. Doors closing. Men who had laughed with him tonight would reconsider whether they wished their own books examined. The punishment had begun before he left the room. Cresswell looked around. No one met his eyes. Lady Honoria finally spoke. "Gideon." He turned. "You will leave Ashcombe tonight." He stared at her. "After everything I protected for you," the words escaped too quickly. The room heard them. Lady Honoria went white. Cresswell realized his mistake. Too late. The Duke's gaze hardened. Protected from what Cresswell said nothing. Lady Honoria stood. "Go." He did. Nobody stopped him at the doors. Nobody followed. The sound of them closing behind him was very small, yet Marianne thought it sounded like the end of something that had lasted far too long. Hartwell then explained the trust. Some of the money could be traced. Some had been lost in transfers. Recovery would require time. Ashcombe would have to repay what could be established as improperly taken. Marianne listened. 8 years earlier, she would have imagined restoration as a great sum placed into her hands. Now the thought felt strangely incomplete. "And the tenants?" she asked. Hartwell paused. "The accounts affecting them will also be reviewed." Before mine, Lady Honoria looked up. Marianne continued. "My roof does not leak." Bess stared at her. The Duke's expression softened. Hartwell nodded. "The repairs can be examined immediately." That was enough. The guests began speaking again, but not loudly. Several approached Hartwell. One asked whether his own estate shared contractors with Cresswell. Another wanted copies of tenant assessments reviewed. Truth was spreading now. Not through corridors, not through ajar doors. Across the ballroom, Lady Honoria remained seated until most of the guests had withdrawn. Verity came to Marianne first. She stopped several feet away. I laughed. Marianne said nothing. "At you?" "Yes." Verity's eyes filled. "I thought it was harmless." Marianne looked at her. "It was harmless to you." Verity flinched. No accusation could have struck harder. She lowered her head. "I am sorry." Marianne believed she meant it. That did not erase anything. Then remember it the next time everyone else is laughing. Verity nodded. She left quietly. Lady Honoria approached last. Without the crowd around her, she seemed smaller. Not weak, simply stripped of the scale other people had given her. Marianne. It was the first time that night she had used the name without contempt. My lady. Lady Honoria looked toward the place beside the pillar where Marianne had stood alone. I knew Cresswell moved money. Marianne waited. I did not know how much. I did not ask. That was the confession. Not that Lady Honoria had engineered every theft, that she had preferred ignorance when ignorance protected her comfort. And my settlement, Lady Honoria's face tightened. He told me using it temporarily would protect Ashcombe, and when I was sent away I convinced myself you would manage. Marianne almost laughed. She had managed. That was not the same as being treated justly. Lady Honoria's voice dropped. I am sorry. There were 100 answers Marianne might have given. She chose none of them. Lady Honoria waited. Marianne simply inclined her head and walked past her. Forgiveness could not be demanded merely because apology had finally become convenient. 3 months later, the first northern cottage roofs were repaired. Bess's mother received a new chimney before the last hard frost. Thomas found work at another estate, after the Duke of Ravenshade personally corrected the account of his dismissal. Mrs. Finch never returned to Ashcombe. She said, 31 years was long enough to polish someone else's silver. Instead, she joined Marianne in Briarwood. Mrs. Pike gave up the small back room of her shop, and Marianne used part of the restored settlement to rent it properly, not to become a lady, to expand the business. Pike and daughter became Pike and Bell. 3 apprentices worked there by spring. Marianne kept the accounts herself. Every shilling still had a column. The Duke of Ravenshade visited twice before Easter. The first time he brought Hartwell. The second time he came alone. He did not speak of marriage. Marianne respected him for that. He asked about the shop, about the apprentices, about Bess's mother. Then he bought a pair of embroidered handkerchiefs he plainly did not need. Marianne suspected Mrs. Pike charged him too much. She did not interfere. Their affection, when it came, grew in the garden behind the shop, exactly where quieter things belonged. No ballroom watched it. No title hurried it. He learned that Marianne disliked lilies. She learned that he hated sugared almonds. He listened when she spoke about tenant records. She corrected his terrible habit of assuming expensive fabric must be good fabric. Months passed. Ashcombe changed more slowly. Lady Honoria lost invitations. Some returned eventually. Many did not. The people who had once found her cruelty amusing discovered that association with scandal was less entertaining when their own names might appear beside hers. Cresswell's professional standing collapsed under the examination of his records. Funds were recovered where they could be traced. Properties connected to the transfers were contested or surrendered through ordinary legal proceedings. No single morning restored everything. Justice rarely worked that neatly, but it worked. One winter evening, almost a year after the assembly, Marianne sat beside the little stove in the workroom after everyone had gone home. Outside snow touched the windows. Inside, Bess had left a loaf of warm bread on the table. Mrs. Finch had forgotten her spectacles beside the account book. A half-finished blue gown waited beneath a linen cloth. Marianne threaded a needle. The Duke of Ravenshade sat opposite her, attempting unsuccessfully to mend one of his own gloves. The thumb was crooked. Marianne looked at it, then at him. She laughed, not because anyone else had laughed first, not because a great room expected it, simply because she was warm, working, and free to laugh. Dignity borrowed from others can be taken away, but dignity built by one's own hands becomes a home no door can close. If Marianne's journey stayed with you, please like the story, subscribe for more Victorian tales of hidden truth and restored dignity, and consider supporting the channel so these stories can continue. Phần đã viết 4 khoảng 9,90, 8, 12 từ.